On the morning of March 14, 1891, 3 men left the settlement of Eureka, Montana, with 260 pounds of supplies and a route that no local would take in early spring. Their names were recorded in the post office ledger: Samuel Weaver, age 34, mine surveyor; Robert Kinnan, age 28, assayer; James Caldwell, age 41, expedition leader and geologist with the Northern Pacific Railway Survey Division. By nightfall, they had entered the Yaak River corridor. They were never seen alive again. The decision to take the northern route through Purcell Trench instead of the established southern trail was made by Caldwell himself, documented in a telegram he sent to his supervisor in Missoula 2 days prior. The message still exists in the Montana Historical Society archives. It reads, "Southern route adds 4 days. Snow firming, North Passage viable if we depart Saturday. We'll make Helena by the 22nd. Eureka in 1891 was not a town in any formal sense. It was a cluster of timber cabins and a single mercantile positioned along the Tobacco River, servicing trappers, railroad scouts, and mineral prospectors moving between the Kootenai and Flathead ranges. The population fluctuated between 30 and 60 depending on the season. There was no sheriff, no doctor. The nearest telegraph line ended 12 miles south at the rail depot in 14. Caldwell had worked for Northern Pacific for 6 years. His previous surveys included difficult terrain in the Bitterroots and Cabinet Mountains. He was regarded by colleagues as competent but impatient. Weaver had been hired on contract for his knowledge of underground hydrology. Kinnan was brought in to assess ore samples from a suspected silver deposit near the Canadian border. All 3 were experienced in wilderness travel. None had families waiting for them in Montana. The weather that week had been warmer than average. Local trappers later told investigators that the temperature rose above 40 degrees Fahrenheit in the afternoons, causing surface melt across the snowpack. By evening, it would drop back below freezing. This created a crust, hard enough to walk on in the morning, deceptive by midday. The shortcut Caldwell proposed followed an old indigenous passage along the base of the Purcell Range. It had been used historically during summer and autumn when the terrain was dry and stable. In winter, it was abandoned. The reasons were well understood by anyone who had spent time in that country. The passage crossed 3 avalanche zones, multiple seasonal creek beds, and a series of benches where snow accumulated in unstable layers. It also ran beneath a ridgeline that trapped weather systems moving west from the Rockies. On March 13th, the day before departure, Caldwell met with a man named Thomas Flint at the Eureka Mercantile. Flint was a trapper who had worked the Yaak drainage for 11 seasons. He was known to be quiet, practical, and uninterested in other people's business. But when Caldwell mentioned the northern route, Flint set down the axe he was sharpening and asked him to repeat himself. According to the store owner's later testimony, Flint then said the following: "You don't go through Purcell Trench in March. I don't care what the weather's been. The pack isn't settled. You'll be walking under loaded slopes the whole way. Take the southern route. You lose 4 days, but you don't lose your life." Caldwell's response was recorded in the same testimony. He said, "I've read the geological surveys. The slope angles are manageable. We're not amateurs." Flint said nothing more. He paid for his supplies and left. The next morning, the 3 men loaded 2 pack mules with food, canvas, rope, surveying instruments, and sample bags. They carried no emergency beacon, no medical kit beyond basic bandages and iodine. Caldwell did carry a Winchester rifle and 60 rounds of ammunition, standard for bear country. The mercantile owner sold them an additional 20 pounds of dried venison, 4 tins of condensed milk, and 2 boxes of matches. At approximately 8 o'clock, they departed northwest along the river corridor. The sky was clear. The temperature was 31 degrees. The decision had already been made. The southern route Caldwell chose to avoid was known as the 14 Loop. It followed the Tobacco River south for 18 miles, then arced west through lower elevation forest before rejoining the primary trail near the Fisher River Junction. The terrain was gradual, the snowpack shallow. The route was longer but predictable. Trappers used it all winter without incident. Caldwell's decision was not irrational within the framework of his experience. He had crossed difficult country before. He had worked through late-season snow in the Bitterroots without injury. His survey reports from previous years show a consistent pattern. He completed assignments ahead of schedule, often by selecting unconventional routes that reduced travel time. His employer valued this. In a letter dated January 1891, Caldwell's supervisor praised him for finishing a cabinet range survey 11 days early, calling it exemplary efficiency in hostile conditions. This was the context in which the decision to take Purcell Trench made sense. Caldwell believed that efficiency was itself a form of competence. He believed that caution, when excessive, became inefficiency. He had been rewarded for this belief throughout his career. Weaver and Kinnan deferred to Caldwell's judgment. This was standard practice. Caldwell was the expedition leader. He carried the maps. He had the authority to set the route. Neither Weaver nor Kinnan had objected during the planning phase. There is no record of dissent. On March 15th, the day after their departure, a trapper named Edwin Cross encountered the group approximately 16 miles northwest of Eureka, near the base of Rattle Ridge. Cross was running his trapline along a creek drainage that intersected the northern route. He later testified that the men appeared in good spirits. They had made strong progress. The mules were steady. Caldwell asked Cross if he had seen any sign of fresh avalanche activity in the corridor ahead. Cross said he had not been that far north in 3 weeks. He told them the same thing Flint had told Caldwell: the route was unsafe in spring. Caldwell thanked him and said they would proceed with caution. Cross watched them continue northwest until they disappeared into the timber. He noted the time as roughly 2 in the afternoon. This was the last confirmed sighting. What Cross did not tell the men, because they did not ask, was that he had heard a deep rumble 2 nights prior, coming from the direction of the high benches above Purcell Trench. He assumed it was distant thunder. It was not thunder season. He did not investigate. The days that followed were unremarkable in Eureka. The mercantile opened and closed. Trappers came and went. A mail courier arrived from 14 with a sack of letters and a bundle of newspapers from Spokane. No one expected to see Caldwell's party again until late March at the earliest. Their timeline called for them to reach Helena by the 22nd, which allowed ample margin. On March 20th, 6 days after the men departed, the temperature dropped sharply. A late-season storm system moved in from the northwest, bringing wet snow and freezing rain. The storm lasted 38 hours. Accumulation in the high country was estimated at 18 to 24 inches. Winds exceeded 40 miles per hour along exposed ridgelines. The storm was not unusual for the region. It was noted in weather logs kept by the rail depot in 14, but it was not considered an emergency. Spring storms were common. They passed. On March 23rd, a telegraph arrived at the 14 depot addressed to James Caldwell. It was from his supervisor in Missoula. The message asked for confirmation of arrival in Helena and requested preliminary survey data. The telegrapher held the message for 2 days, assuming Caldwell was delayed by weather. When no response came, he forwarded the telegram to the Eureka Mercantile. The store owner pinned it to the wall behind the counter. He assumed Caldwell would collect it when he returned through Eureka on his way south. This was standard practice for delayed parties. By the end of March, no one in Eureka was concerned. Delays of a week or more were routine in winter travel. Caldwell's timeline had included buffer days. The assumption was that the storm had slowed them, or that they had decided to wait out the weather before continuing. It was not until April 7th, 3 weeks after departure, that Caldwell's employer in Missoula sent a second telegram. This one was addressed to the Eureka postmaster, asking if anyone had seen or heard from the survey party. The postmaster was a man named Arthur Lang. He consulted the mercantile owner, who checked his records. The last confirmed interaction with the group had been on March 14th, the day of departure. Lang sent a return telegram stating that the men had left Eureka on schedule and had not been seen since. He added that the route they intended to take was through Purcell Trench. The message reached Missoula on April 8th. On April 9th, Northern Pacific Railway formally requested a search. The moment that defined everything occurred sometime in the late morning of March 14th, approximately 3 hours after the men left Eureka. The exact time cannot be known. The decision itself was likely made without ceremony. Caldwell would have consulted his map. He would have looked northwest toward the opening of Purcell Trench. He would have assessed the conditions. Then he would have given the order to proceed. The route entered the trench through a narrow corridor, flanked by steep, timbered slopes. The floor of the trench was relatively flat, following the course of an old glacial drainage. Snow depth varied. In the protected sections beneath dense forest, it was 2 to 3 feet. In the open meadows, where wind had scoured and redeposited the pack, it was deeper. The surface was firm in the morning cold, as Caldwell had predicted. The first warning sign would have appeared within the first hour. As the men moved deeper into the corridor, the terrain began to rise. The forest thinned. The slopes above them steepened. This was noted in the geological survey maps Caldwell carried, but the maps showed elevation contours and drainage patterns. They did not show snowpack stability. They did not show avalanche paths. Anyone familiar with the country would have recognized the terrain for what it was, a natural funnel. The ridges above the trench formed a catchment for wind-driven snow. The slopes were angled between 35 and 45 degrees, the precise range where slab avalanches form most readily. The forest coverage was broken, meaning there were open sections where snow could accumulate without the anchoring effect of trees. Caldwell would have seen this. He was a trained geologist. He understood slope mechanics. But understanding terrain and understanding snow are different skills. Caldwell had no training in avalanche assessment. Neither did Weaver or Kinnan. The temperature that morning had started near freezing. By midday, it had risen into the low 40s. The sun was direct. The snow surface, which had been supportive at dawn, began to soften. With each step, the men broke through the crust. The mules struggled. Progress slowed. At some point during the afternoon of March 14th, the group would have reached the section of the trench that ran directly beneath a series of high benches on the western slope. These benches were identified in later searches as the most unstable features along the entire route. They were broad, treeless expanses positioned above cliffs and talus fields. Snow accumulated there in deep, wind-loaded layers. The benches faced southeast, which meant they received full sun during the afternoon. This is where the decision became irreversible. The men were tired. They had been walking for 6 or 7 hours. The mules needed rest. The logical action would have been to stop, make camp in the timber, and wait for the temperature to drop before continuing. But stopping meant losing time. Caldwell's entire plan was built on speed. The route was supposed to save 4 days. If they stopped now, the advantage vanished. There is no record of debate, no journal entries, no letters. The decision to continue was likely made by Caldwell alone, based on the same logic that had brought them into the trench in the first place. The risk was manageable, and the reward was worth it. They continued northwest. The collapse, when it came, was not dramatic in the way avalanches are sometimes imagined. There was no visible crack, no thunderous roar that gave warning. Slab avalanches often release silently, or nearly so. The first indication is movement, a slight shift in the snow beneath your feet. By the time you feel it, the decision is no longer yours. The slope above the benches fractured along a natural weak layer buried 18 inches below the surface. The fracture propagated across 300 yards of open terrain in less than 2 seconds. The slab that released was estimated in later analysis to weigh between 600 and 800 tons. It moved down the slope at approximately 60 miles per hour. The men would have had no time to react. The distance from the fracture line to the floor of the trench was roughly 400 vertical feet. The debris path covered the trail completely. The force of the slide was sufficient to snap mature timber and carry boulders the size of wagons. Anything caught in the path would have been buried under 10 to 15 feet of compacted snow and ice. The mules, the supplies, the instruments, the men, all of it gone in under 30 seconds. By the time the debris settled, the surface of the deposit was smooth and still. The sun continued to shine. The forest was silent. There were no witnesses, no one to send for help. The shortcut had delivered exactly what Thomas Flint had predicted. On the evening of March 14th, as the temperature dropped and the snow refroze, the site became indistinguishable from the surrounding terrain. Within 2 days, the late-season storm added another 2 feet of snow. By the time anyone thought to search, the evidence was buried under a landscape that had returned to winter. The decision to take the shortcut had been made in confidence. It ended in silence. The search began on April 12, 1891, 29 days after Caldwell's party entered Purcell Trench. A team of 6 men, organized by Northern Pacific Railway and led by a Eureka trapper named William Moss, departed northwest along the known route. They carried probes, shovels, and provisions for 2 weeks. Their objective was to locate the survey party or determine what had happened to them. Moss reached the entrance to Purcell Trench on the 2nd day. He stopped immediately. The condition of the corridor made it clear that travel through the area during mid-March would have been catastrophic. He noted multiple avalanche paths, some recent, some older. The debris fields were enormous. In his written report, filed with the railway on April 27th, Moss described the scene as impassable and deadly. The search team spent 4 days probing debris fields along the most likely travel route. They found nothing. The snow was too deep, the area too vast. Moss estimated that a thorough search would require 30 men and equipment they did not have. On April 16th, he called off the effort and returned to Eureka. A second search was authorized in late May, after the snowpack had begun to melt. This team included 2 men from Missoula with experience in avalanche recovery. They concentrated their efforts on the high benches above the trench, where Moss had identified the largest and most recent slide paths. On May 28th, they found the first piece of evidence. It was a leather satchel, partially buried in runoff gravel at the base of a debris fan. Inside were surveying notes, a compass, and a tintype photograph of a woman. The notes were written in Caldwell's hand. The photograph was unidentified. The satchel had been torn open, likely by the force of the avalanche. 2 days later, on May 30th, the team found one of the mules. The animal was located 400 yards downslope from the primary debris field, lodged against a cluster of fallen timber. The body was badly decomposed. No supplies or equipment were found nearby. The location suggested the mule had been carried a significant distance by the slide. On June 2nd, the searchers found human remains. The body was partially uncovered by snowmelt along the edge of a secondary debris lobe. Identification was difficult. The remains were badly damaged. Clothing fragments suggested it was one of the surveyors, but which one could not be determined. No other bodies were found. The search continued until June 9th, when the team exhausted their provisions and concluded that further effort was unlikely to yield results. The final report noted that the primary avalanche site was still covered by residual snow and ice, and that complete recovery would require excavation beyond their capacity. The report recommended that the area be researched in late summer after full snowmelt. No additional searches were conducted. Northern Pacific Railway closed the case on July 15, 1891. The official conclusion was death by avalanche. No fault was assigned. The incident was recorded as a wilderness tragedy, common enough in Montana during that era. Caldwell's supervisor in Missoula wrote to the company headquarters in St. Paul, summarizing the loss. He noted that Caldwell had been a valuable employee. He did not mention the decision to take the northern route. He did not mention the warnings Caldwell had received. The letter was filed and forgotten. In Eureka, the disappearance was discussed briefly, then absorbed into the background of daily life. Thomas Flint, the trapper who had warned Caldwell, never spoke of it publicly. Edwin Cross, who had seen the men on March 15th, continued running his trapline. The mercantile owner kept his records. The telegram addressed to Caldwell remained pinned to the wall for several months before it was taken down and discarded. The families of Weaver and Kinnan were notified by letter. Both men had relatives in the eastern states. Neither family traveled to Montana. There was nothing to see and nothing to recover. The bodies, if they still existed, were somewhere beneath tons of rock and frozen debris in a remote corridor that few people would ever visit again. Caldwell had no immediate family. His personal effects, stored in a boarding house in Missoula, were sold to cover unpaid rent. His name appeared in a Northern Pacific Railway internal memorandum dated August 1891, listing employees lost in the line of duty. He was one of 4 men on that list for the year. The shortcut through Purcell Trench was never used again. It was not officially closed because it had never been officially open. It simply returned to what it had always been, a passage taken only by animals and wind. The decision Caldwell made was not recorded in any monument. There was no grave, no marker. The only evidence that 3 men had died there was a brief entry in a railway logbook and a few scattered documents in a Missoula archive filed under Survey Operations 1891. Everything that followed, the searches, the reports, the letters, traced back to a single moment on the morning of March 14th, a moment when a man looked at a map, assessed the conditions, and chose speed over caution. The consequences were absolute. In 1926, 35 years after the disappearance, a historian named Frances Holbrook was researching early Northern Pacific Railway survey operations for a regional history of Montana's development. She came across the incident while reviewing company records in the St. Paul archives. The case interested her because of its completeness. The entire sequence, from decision to consequence, was documented in telegrams, reports, and witness statements. It was a rare thing, a tragedy with a clear cause. Holbrook traveled to Montana in the summer of 1927. She visited Eureka, which by then had become a small incorporated town with a population of just over 200. The mercantile was still operating under new ownership. None of the original witnesses were still alive. Thomas Flint had died in 1904. Edwin Cross had moved to Idaho in 1898. William Moss, who led the first search, had died in 1919. Holbrook interviewed the children and grandchildren of the men who had known Caldwell. She reviewed what few local records still existed. She traveled to the mouth of Purcell Trench, though she did not enter it. The terrain had not changed. The benches above the corridor still shed avalanches every spring. In her notes preserved now in the Montana Historical Society, Holbrook wrote the following: "There is nothing remarkable about this story except its ordinariness. Caldwell was not reckless. He was experienced and educated. He made a decision that was logical within the framework of his knowledge. He believed he understood the risk. He was wrong. The mountains do not care about credentials. They do not negotiate." Holbrook's work was never published as a standalone account. The incident appeared as a footnote in her broader history of railway surveys, which was printed in a limited run by a university press in 1929. The book is out of print. Copies exist in a handful of research libraries. In the decades that followed, Purcell Trench was occasionally mentioned in avalanche safety literature as an example of terrain that should not be traveled during unstable conditions. The names of Caldwell, Weaver, and Kinnan do not appear in these references. The incident is cited only by location and date: Northern Montana, March 1891. There is no memorial. The site of the avalanche is unmarked. The debris field, visible for decades, was gradually covered by vegetation and new snowfall. The forest reclaimed the corridor. Hikers and hunters sometimes pass through the area in summer and autumn, unaware of what lies beneath. In 2003, a backcountry skier triggered a small avalanche on one of the benches above the trench. He survived. In his incident report filed with the Forest Service, he noted that the slope had released on a weak layer buried deep in the snowpack. He described the terrain as classic avalanche country and recommended it be flagged for public safety warnings. The recommendation was not implemented. The area is remote. It sees little traffic. The risks are considered self-evident to anyone with experience. The only physical evidence of Caldwell's party that still exists is the satchel recovered in May of 1891. It is held in a storage facility in Missoula, catalogued under Northern Pacific Railway Company, Miscellaneous Survey Materials, 1880-1900. The photograph found inside the satchel is still there, pressed between the pages of a field notebook. The woman in the photograph has never been identified. What remains is the decision, not the bodies, not the equipment, not the route, just the choice. preserved in documents and records made on a clear morning in March by a man who believed that competence and confidence were sufficient. They were not. The shortcut saved nothing. It cost everything. And when the snow fell silent on the evening of March 14th, 1891, it buried not just 3 men, but the assumption that knowledge alone could outwit the mountains. The lesson, if there is one, is not complex. It is this: the warning was given, it was heard, it was dismissed. What followed was not fate, it was consequence.